Hey everybody, my name is Aaron Rieke, and I'm here with Vincent Southerland, Dan Svirsky, and Mingwei. And we're going to give you the short presentation of our paper, Imperfect Inferences, a Practical Assessment. Quick preface here, we're at a moment where this community, tech companies, folks in DC are all really interested in the use of racial and other demographic inferences to measure and remediate discrimination. And obviously, in many cases, there's not labeled data available to do that measurement or intervention work. And so the goal of our paper was to really look at common racial inference methods and see how well they perform in a really practical environment. And here that environment is the company Uber. And so I'm going to hand it over to Dan here to give you just a quick peek at our findings. And if you're interested in more, I hope you'll look at our longer presentation. Dan?
Great. Thanks, Aaron. So what we do in this paper is we take advantage of a data set from about 12,000 Uber users from 2019 who agreed to give their self-reported demographics for research purposes. And what that allows us to do is compare the demographic inference approaches, 4 different ones, to these self-reports to see how accurate these approaches are. And then we could look at different outcomes on Uber, outcomes in the world, geographic outcomes, to basically measure whether, if there are underlying disparities by group, we still pick up those disparities if we rely on inferences instead of self-reported demographics. So the first point that we want to make is just looking at the summary statistics for this group of 12,000 users. Again, this is data from 2019, and we bring in a bunch of different outcomes here, some from the Uber platform, some from publicly available data sets. And I think the first thing that jumps out is that race has really shaped our society. It shapes the society we're in, that Uber operates in, and you could really tell that here. So what this graph looks at is different outcomes, the average outcome by different self-reported demographics. One that jumps out, for instance, looking about 5 rows down, is historically redlined neighborhoods. So we see, for instance, that self-reported African-American users are more likely to have trips that picked up in a historically redlined neighborhood. And what's interesting about that is that this is a policy that was developed in the 1930s, so almost a century ago, but we still see the vestiges of that even in data today. So we do see these kinds of disparities across a whole host of different outcomes. And so the question then is, can we detect these if we have to rely on inference? So going to the next slide, the first question is just how accurate are these inferences? And what this graph shows is for one of the inferences we used, and I encourage you to go to the paper, to the longer presentation to learn more about the inferences we tested. It looks at how well the inference does at categorizing people compared to their self-reports. So on the left, you could see people who self-identify as Asian or Asian American. Most of them get correctly classified by the inference method as Asian or Asian American. When there is a mistake, it tends to miscategorize self-reported Asian or Asian American users as white. The same pattern is true for Latinx users. And then moving on to white and African American or Black users, the biggest mistake we tend to see is that actually a small majority of self-reported African-American or Black users get miscategorized as white. And this is an inference approach that tries to guess based on someone's name. And so this is a problem that we've seen in other parts of the literature. Going to the next slide, we see similar outcomes, but different types of mistakes with the other 3 inference methods we use. So the main takeaway is that there are real inaccuracies with these inference methods. They do make misclassification errors that aren't minuscule. But that's not exactly the question we're interested in. Going to the next slide, the question we're really interested in is, if there's an underlying disparity among self-reported users in some outcome in this data, can we detect that if we have to rely on an inference method? Or is using the inference going to fool us into thinking there's no disparity when there is one, or vice versa? And here the news is more positive, that these inferences are imperfect, but roughly they work. So here, for instance, we could look at the proportion of trips a user took in 2019 that had a pickup or drop off in an area with a high density of restaurants. And we could see on the left, among self-reported white users, this was more common than among self-reported African-American users, about 6% to 4%, looking at the bars on the left. If instead we look at the proportion of trips in areas with high density of restaurants among inferred white users or inferred African-American users, using any of the 4 inference methods we tested, we get the same basic directional result. On the right, you could see this with a little bit more detail too, and some error bars that basically, and this is true among a whole host of outcomes that we tested, the inference methods roughly work. Looking at the next slide, what's interesting too is that in some cases, the inference methods can also tell us a little bit, we suspect, about what might be going on in the underlying disparity. So here we're looking at pollution levels in the pickup location. And this is among, I think, one of the more sad graphs in our paper in the data, because it shows that there are disparities in how much pollution people are exposed to just based on where their Uber trips pick up. But what I want to draw people's attention to here is that looking at the different inference methods, the ones that incorporate geography are a little bit more accurate compared to the self-reports than the ones that just rely on name. And what we suspect might be happening is that sometimes if there's a disparity that's geographic in nature, like this one, or a disparity that has to do with someone's name or how they present, then an inference that tracks how the disparity works might be more effective than one that doesn't and can tell you a little bit more about what might be going on. So the inference method you use shouldn't be independent of what you think is the underlying discrimination or disparity that might be occurring. So with that, I'll hand it back to Aaron to tie things up here.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening to the presentation. We're going to save most of the discussions and implications here for our longer presentation, but suffice to say, I think what we have in this paper is some really encouraging evidence that although these inferences are really imperfect, they should have practical utility, at least in some of these corporate settings. So thanks for listening, and reach out to us with any questions. Thanks.